السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا المرسلين النبي الأمي مصطفى محمد مهند. Today we're going to talk about refuting Orientalism, ورد الاستشراق, and this is for Dawah training. And if you can see in the corner down here, I have done my share of Dawah booths in the past. And the idea here is that, you're going to run into people who have heard of Orientalist ideas, and they will try to argue you with those ideas. And so it's important to have a basic grasp as to what Orientalism is, or Arabism, what's called, Arabist is called a Musta'arab. So trying to get a grasp of what this all is or what it means is really important. And it's also important if you are an activist in the Muslim community, or you're some sort of community organizer, you're an imam, a sheikh, you're doing pastoral care, some sort of chaplaincy in the community, anything like that. It's good to know the basics of Orientalism, because the youth are being bombarded with these ideas in high school and college. And I have this quote here from Edward Wadi' Said, who was a professor at Columbia University, and he wrote the very famous book Orientalism. And he said, "Every empire, however, tells itself and the world that it is unlike all other empires, that its mission is not to plunder and control, but to educate and liberate." And he's talking about the West. Isn't this what the United States always says about the Middle East? Oh, we're going to Iraq to educate and to liberate, give them democracy and freedom. So Orientalism parades itself as this oh so generous and kind thing. And here's Edward Said's famous book, Orientalism, Western Conceptions of the Orient. And for this presentation, we're going to be operating through this binary of East versus West, or the fancy words, which comes from French, is the Orient versus the Occident. However, it's notable that Edward Said did not believe in this binary. He thought it was a false binary. And really, after the initial Islamic conquest during the rightly guided caliphs, the Khulafa Rashidin, the Muslims essentially captured half of the Mediterranean world. They conquered the Levant, Sham. They conquered Egypt and North Africa and Spain. And so half of the Mediterranean was taken away from the Roman Empire. So, before that, it was Byzantium versus Persia. Byzantium referred to the whole Mediterranean, and then Persia, of course, being in what's modern day Iran, Iraq, Khorasan. That includes Afghanistan and Tajikistan. They had influence in Uzbekistan, all these different places, right? And so it was the Persianate world against the Byzantine world. But that all changed with the Islamic expansion, where we took half of the Byzantine territory and all of the Persianate territory. So it became the Byzantines versus the Muslims, or the East versus the West, as it became thought in European culture. And so I'm going to give you a brief rundown here of kind of how Orientalism developed. Why did the West, former Roman Mediterranean Empire, why did the West want to study the East? What was their reasoning? Well, initially it was to refute Muslims theologically, as well as to kind of have knowledge of the enemy empire, so to say. And so it's always been imbued with polemics from Christianity. Um, Being Christian was seen as being part of the Christian empire. Being Muslim meant you were part of the Muslim empire. And if you were to change religion, essentially you're changing your allegiance to whichever empire. So it had political connotations that could mean life or death. And so the first tenable, some might debate that, translation of the Quran into a Western language was in 1143, and that was into Latin with Lex Muhammad Pseudo Prophet by Robert of Ketton. It was later translated into Latin many other times because people found that translation inadequate. And so that we see that already in the 12th century there. And this is, like shortly after the time of Imam al-Ghazali, for instance. So their knowledge of Islam was very much lacking in that time period, just because of the restrictions of travel and the inaccessibility to texts and the lack of experts who knew Arabic. That started to change in the 1600s. Why did that start to change in the 1600s? Well, the age of exploration, as it's innocently called in Western historiography, basically the beginning of colonization, shortly after the Renaissance. So the Renaissance was kind of this emergence of Western scholarly activity inspired by Latin translations of Arabic texts, especially texts that have been translated from Greek to Arabic and then to Latin. Al-Ghazali was translated as well, and he was known as El-Ghazal. We have Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, Avicenna, Averroes, that started to become known. And as the West was expanding its colonial empire, they needed to have experts that were aware of had some knowledge of these cultures that they were trying to conquer. And so European universities in the 1600s began establishing professorships of Arabic. And you start to see Arabists as a specialized discipline in the 1600s. And the early 1600s had the famous 30 Years' War in European history. Unfortunately, the 30 Years' War isn't taught as much as it should be in high school curriculum in America. I believe it's taught more heavily in European curriculum overseas in their high school system, naturally. But it was extremely a crucial turning point in Western history. It was basically sectarian religious warfare, Protestants against Catholics in Europe, and it lasted literally 30 years, 3 decades. It was extremely vicious and bloody. If you look at the image there, you have a guy holding a spear next to a guy holding a gun. So this is where you started to see, the use of gunpowder, rifles, early rifles, right? Because before this, gunpowder had been limited more to cannons. So you're seeing this transition from medieval warfare to modern warfare that's happening. And just like with World War I or World War II, where there's a lot of new technology, military technology causes quite a lot of bloodshed when it's something that is unanticipated, unexpected. Like with machine guns in World War I, and trench warfare, chemical warfare, all those things were unexpected and caused a huge amount of casualties. Same thing with the American Civil War, introduced rifling to their weaponry, which caused a massive amount of casualties. They didn't know quite how to deal with those type of gunshot wounds, and there were many amputees. Same thing with the 30 Years' War, just massive casualties. And Germany, what's now we call Germany, was utterly devastated by this war. Villages, towns, cities completely obliterated, and it had to be rebuilt. Various different principalities or countries, armies were dwindled down to almost nothing. It was a very vicious and brutal war. And because of the 30 Years' War in the West, it became decided that religion could not be in the political or public sphere, the public square, if you will. And this concept of the secular developed, where you have a public sort of space where religion is just not discussed, because religion causes war, and religion causes fanaticism and violence and all these ideas. And in order to keep people from fighting each other, we can't have religion in the public space. And that all goes back to the 30 Years' War. That type of thought sprang from the violence and the trauma that lasted more than one generation, 30 years, right? And not that long after, you have Napoleon, who invades Egypt and Syria. And this was a shock to the Muslim world, kind of like the Crusades was. This was a major shock. Even though it only lasted 3 years, it shook Egypt and Syria to their core, and you might say the whole Muslim empire to their core. You know, this is the Ottoman Empire being invaded by a European power. And it also kind of marks the beginning of Orientalism proper, if you will, or something that is more recognizable as Orientalism to us. And you have, Dussacy from France, who, studied in Egypt. So a lot of these Orientalists traveled along with Napoleon's army to do studies in Egypt and in Syria. And ever since then, you've had Orientalists of various sorts in Western universities that have done research on Islamic history and taught about Islamic thought and these types of things, right? Which we'll get to here in a moment. And then with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, 1979, there's a huge resurgence of Orientalism that takes place. All of a sudden, there's massive new interest, and it becomes known as what I like to call the era of Neo-Orientalism, which is what we're in now. And then, of course, with 9/11, there was another resurgence of it, but really it was with the Islamic Revolution in Iran that kind of propelled the field. And they were still kind of on that, riding that wave, if you will, when 9/11 happened. 9/11 just added more fuel to the fire, and the field kept going very strongly. And so we also got to talk about what is the secular. I mentioned earlier with the 30 Years' War that the secular was an idea developed because Christians were fighting one another in Europe. Protestants versus Catholics, right? Therefore, their only frame of reference as to what religion is was Christianity. And what they saw as neutral and secular or irreligious was myopic, in the sense that what they saw as secular was basically what Catholics and Protestants agreed on and what they did not disagree on. And you had some skeptics, some atheists, and some Jews and things who made arguments in the West that kind of maybe shifted the way the secular was perceived, but it's largely, you could say, imbued with Judeo-Christian, ideas from a Western eye. And so Talal Asad, he's an anthropologist. He's the son of the famous Quran translator Muhammad Asad, who has the famous book A Road to Mecca. His son became an anthropologist, and Talal Asad, he has multiple books on how this concept of the secular evolved and alters our understanding of what religion means, because there's this binary between secular and religious that develops after the 30 Years' War. And before that, it didn't exist, which is something that Talal Asad has uncovered in the historical archives. And so I highly recommend taking a look at his books on the secular, which I'll talk about a little bit more in this presentation. And then I have these books down here: White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. So that's talking about the American context in particular, but it's pretty applicable to most Western countries. We're talking about why, quote unquote, secular politics has failed to acknowledge non-Christian traditions, because secularity is so entrenched in the Christian tradition. And Paul Kivel, who is a rabbi, he wrote this book, Living in the Shadow of the Cross: Understanding and Resisting the Power and Privilege of Christian Hegemony. And he goes in quite detail about how so many secular concepts or ideas about even like secular law or the constitutional law and all of these things go back to Christian theology, and they're all based in assumptions of Christian civilization. And then, of course, the book The Racial Muslim, or Innocent Until Proven Muslim, just goes to show how secular ideologies of various sorts have highly oppressed Muslims and have highly misunderstood Muslims and Islam, and they clearly aren't giving freedom of religion to Muslims, and in fact causing trauma and violence to Muslims. So this is what secularism has done to us under the guise of being irreligious. And getting back to Orientalism. So in the Western tradition of doing history with the Enlightenment, you had historian Leopold von Ranke, who's considered one of the most influential historians in the Western tradition as far as theory of history, or the fancy word is historiography. And he came up with this idea called historismus, or historicism. And it's known as the historical critical method, or HCM for short. And it's based in Christian theology, even though it presents itself as secular. And it was used to, for biblical studies, to criticize biblical manuscripts and histories that are found in the Bible. And Orientalism was always kind of related to biblical studies, because biblical scholars would study Arabic and other Semitic languages like Syriac or Aramaic, Hebrew, in order to understand the Bible. And Arabic was a language that they could use to help them understand Hebrew, because they have the same Semitic trilateral roots. And so the Orientalists of the day, such as Ignaz Itzhak Yehuda Goldziher, who was a Hungarian Jewish scholar that wrote in German. He picked up these ideas, from Leopold von Ranke of Historismus. In those days, that was what you did as a historian to be quote unquote scientific. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you had to follow what this paradigm that Leopold von Ranke had put down. And basically what the method says in a nutshell is that human beings are fundamentally bad. They lie about historical reports. And therefore, you have to corroborate any historical report with other information. Another historical report, perhaps, archaeological data, perhaps, or some other type of data. You need corroboration, because otherwise this person could be lying for their own personal, economic gain, political gain, to spread some sort of ideology. Like, it was always a very suspicious of human nature, which goes against the Islamic concept of human nature, or the fitrah. And so I want to show this book here, Al-Imanu Fitratun, Faith is a Primordial Nature, which is by the American scholar Omar Farouk Abd-Allah Wymann-Landgraf. It's probably the best book I've ever seen written in any language on the fitrah, and it's very non-controversial and not here to debate between Ash'ari and Athari and Maturidi or anything like that. It's just from Quran and Sunnah, all the stuff that Quran and Sunnah says about the fitrah. So if you can read Arabic, I highly recommend that you check out that book. Back to Ignaz Goldziher. He famously published the book Mohammedanische Studien, which is in 2 volumes, which he dedicated to his friend Snoek Hergronier, who we'll get to here right now. So Christian Snoek Hergronier, he was a Dutch Orientalist who lived during the same time as Ignaz Goldziher. And like Ignaz Goldziher, he denied all hadith as apocryphal. He's saying the hadith were made up. So the Mohammedanische Studien, that book from Ignaz Goldziher, he argues strongly that the majority of hadith are all made up. And Hergronier also argued the same, which I have in the citation there. And he cited Goldziher in his works, and he followed the historical critical method from Leopold von Ranke. And he posited, like others, that hadith, they had non-Islamic origins, but were kind of like Islamicized later on. And both Hergronier and Goldziher faked conversions to Islam or pretended to be Muslim. They wore Islamic clothing when they were in Muslim countries to take advantage of traditional Islamic knowledge. So here's a picture of Hergronier dressed, in Islamic garb, and he attended the Hajj, in Mecca, and did research in Mecca. And Goldziher did the same in Egypt in order to study at Al-Azhar University. So they used deception as part of their method of studying Muslims. And this might have been out of preservation of their life, various social pressures and things like that. Hamid Dabashi, someone we'll get to in a little bit, has also argued that Goldziher had a sincere conversion of Islam, but later left Islam and reverted back to Judaism. So it's kind of a complicated issue, but it is something that is characteristic of Orientalists of this time. And at the turn of the century, we have Gotthelf Bergsträsser. And Bergsträsser, he also believed all hadith as apocryphal and originating in non-Islamic sources, and he broadened that to Islamic law in general. He said Islamic law has non-Islamic sources coming from Roman law or ancient Near Eastern law or Persian law, and it was later Islamicized or dressed in an Islamic garb. And so he has this famous book, Grundzüge des islamischen Rechts, which was edited by his student, Joseph Schacht, who was his grad student, a very famous professor who we'll get to in a moment. And so Bergsträsser originally focused on the Roman and Greek classics, but switched to Semitic philology. Maybe he had an interest in biblical studies, but it soon transformed into an interest into Islam and Islamic law in particular. He was an open anti-Nazi, and it is strongly suspected that he was killed by Nazi hooligans in 1933 on a hiking trip. And his student, Joseph Schacht, discovered his book manuscript and edited it posthumously and published it. And so it was published a couple years later in 1935. But like many of these Orientalists, Bergsträsser, Ignaz Goldziher, and Gronier in particular, they were all directly related to colonialism. Gronier had worked for basically the East India Company, Dutch East India Company, and things of that nature, and their knowledge was used by political powers in order to colonize the Muslim world, even if they themselves directly were not involved in that, although Gronier was. So that's important to note. And next to his student, Joseph Schacht. Joseph Schacht was a graduate student under Bergsträsser, and in 1932 he took his second academic position at the University of Königsberg, and after Bergsträsser's death he had to leave Germany as well, because he also was a anti-Nazi. And so he went to live in Cairo, Egypt. He even taught at a university there in Cairo for a while, and he had an apartment there with quite the home library, as he mentions in his preface to the Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, his most famous book. And after the Second World War broke out, he went to England. He worked for the British government in for their intelligence, so he was more or less like a British spy, and he taught at the University of Oxford, and he helped with British colonialism in West Africa, Nigeria, very actively involved in the research and study of Islamic law and colonial expansion for the British. And he briefly also taught Arabic in Leiden in the Netherlands, which was a very prestigious appointment, but I think he was only there for about 3 years, and then eventually he made his way to Columbia University in New York, where he became a professor. And he was really the first in the American academy to research Islamic law. And this is kind of when Islamic studies in the American academe is taking off. We had Arabists or Semiticists in America in the 1800s, but for someone to specifically focus on the history of Islamic political thought or intellectual history didn't really take off until the 50s. And so he had published his book, The Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, in 1950, and it was really a famous book. It was kind of the first big monograph on this topic, and it became the de facto cornerstone, I guess, book on Islamic law in the Western Academy, not just America, but the European American, Australian, academe. Um, and still to this day, if you're going to research Islamic law in the West, that is a book you will have to deal with. You'll have to mention it in some type of way, refute it, accept it, take a middle position, whatever. You have to deal with it. And that's why on my YouTube channel, I, am doing my own explanation of the book and reading it and going over the book in its entirety. However long that'll take me in my life, I don't know, but that is my plan. And then on the scene comes Edward Wadi Said, or Edward Wadi Said. And he was born in 1935 in Palestine, but he was raised in Egypt. And he did his bachelor's at Princeton University in 1957, his master's at Harvard in 1960, and he did his PhD also at Harvard in 1964 in English literature. And in 1963, even before he finished his PhD, he started teaching at Columbia University, the same university that Joseph Schacht was teaching at. And he was teaching in the English and Comparative Literature department, which he stayed at until he died in 2003, al-marhum. Originally, he had done his research, in that field of English and Comparative Literature, but his life in the academe disturbed him because of the racism and Islamophobia that he witnessed as an Arab Christian in academia. So he used his tools of cultural critique and literary criticism against the racist colonizing field of Orientalism to gut its epistemological underpinnings. And so he had this book that he wrote, Orientalism, Western Conceptions of the Orient. And in the book, Edward Said, he says, Orientalism has three basic concepts. It's an academic field of inquiry. It's a worldview, system of representation, and style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and the Occident. And it's a powerful tool of intellectual and colonial domination, right? So it's a whole world view, a system of representation that is used for domination, not only just intellectually, but also colonially, meaning politically. Nowadays, we might not have as much political domination, but surely the West is still trying to intellectually dominate all non-Westerners, even now. But Edward Said doubted this binary between the East and the West, a distinction that didn't exist until the Islamic expansion, like I mentioned before. And European literature for Said carried actualized and propelled Orientalist notions. It propelled Orientalist notions forward and constantly reinforced them. In other words, literature produced by Europeans made possible the political domination of people of the East because of the Orientalist discourse embedded within these texts. Literature here is understood as a carrier and distributor of ideology or propaganda, if you will. So his famous book hits the scene in 1978, and it changes the field forever. It causes people to take sides. Am I Orientalist or am I against Orientalism? And do I take a middle path somehow? But you had to respond to his book. And being an Orientalist almost became synonymous with being a racist. That Orientalism was just a psychological exercise in the self-affirmation of European identity. That it's a field of domination, not an objective exercise of intellectual inquiry that it presented itself to be. Therefore, Orientalism was a method of practical and cultural discrimination that was applied to non-European societies and peoples in order to establish European imperial domination. In justification of empire, the Orientalist claims to know more essential and definitive knowledge about the Orient than do the Orientals. So that type of arrogance and hubris in the Western academe is what Edward Said has always wanted to undermine and resist. And Wa'il Halaq, who is a professor at Columbia University now, where Schacht and Edward Said were professors at, Wa'il Halaq is there now, and he was born in Nazareth in 1955, went to the University of Haifa, and then got his PhD from the University of Washington. And he famously wrote this book, Restating Orientalism, just very recently came out, 2018. And it's restating Edward Said's book, Orientalism, right? But he wants to take it further than Edward Said took it. And he wants to show that, no, Edward Said was still arguing from Western modernity, from Western philosophies. And we have to go beyond that. In fact, we have to undermine Western modernity or the Enlightenment philosophies as a whole, because they are dangerous to the world. They cause harm all over the world. And so Professor Aziz Rana of Cornell Law School describes Restating Orientalism as a brilliant interrogation of Edward Said's famous concept, highlighting the extent which the issue of Orientalism is not simply one of problematic European authors, but instead goes to the heart of how the modern project itself constitutes subjects' knowledge and power. It is essential reading and will be debated by scholars for years to come. Walter Mignolo said of Restating Orientalism that it is becoming increasingly evident amongst decolonial thinkers that colonial management, with or without colonies, with or without settlers, is a question of controlling and managing knowledge, and that power differential is implicit in agents, institutions, and languages of epistemic governance. Wa'il B. Halaq brilliantly drives us through a meticulous reading of Edward Said's Orientalism to the awareness that domination is grounded on epistemic sovereignty, meaning having sovereignty of your own worldview, and that liberation is unthinkable without epistemic freedom. In other words, Halaq's main argument is that Edward Said's book did not go far enough, it was not radical enough. Edward Said was still arguing from modernity, which is itself a European colonizing paradigm that is utterly unable to understand religious phenomena, nor pre-modern epistemologies, such as Islamic epistemologies. Halaq goes on throughout the book to criticize modernity as a whole and demonstrating its harmful effects on humanity. So he says here, secular humanism, anthropocentrism, Enlightenment rationalism, and liberalism, all of which rest on a mechanistic impulse and sovereign domination of the world, are increasingly viewed as too costly to maintain and as an excessive and unjustifiable, if not immoral, overreach. All this notwithstanding their benefits, undoubted benefits with equally undoubted disastrous side effects. And so he's an author that is very important that I hope you all read regarding Orientalism. And Jonathan A.C. Brown, who I'm sure that many of you have heard of, graduated, with a Bachelor of Arts in History from Georgetown University. He also studied at the American University of Cairo, which I've had the pleasure to visit. And he did his PhD at the University of Chicago, which is my alma mater where I did my master's. And he has this famous book, Hadith, where he critiques the modern Western historical critical method from Leopold von Ranke, as I mentioned earlier. And he talks about it in terms of hadith, because remember, many of these Orientalists denied hadith, and some of them will even deny that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, existed at all, or that there was a believers movement before Islam was really codified, things like of this nature. And so secularism is a Western modern concept which emerged from the 30 Years' War, as we discussed, and this intergenerational trauma was passed down, and the concept of the public square and secularism. But Western civilization couldn't live up to their ideal of the secular because they were so myopic, only knowing Christian thought. But basically, they just created a safe space for Christianity, of different, Christians of different denominations to work together collectively and politically for the common good. So the idea known as secular is actually based heavily in Christian theology, and the Western historical critical method is permeated with the Christian idea of original sin. Remember how I talked about with human nature? They believe that humans are evil or bad automatically in their nature, which is from original sin. And therefore, because humans are originally sinful, we can't trust their historical reports unless we can corroborate it or verify it with other evidence. Where the fitrah in Islam is saying, no, people are inherently good. And therefore, if they're trustworthy and there's no outward sign that they're evil or immoral, then we'll take their historical report even without corroboration. As long as there's a sahih chain of narration, a good sanad, and they're thiqah, trustworthy, pious, salih, then we will take that report. And it's a fundamental difference between how Western civilization and Islamic civilization view human nature. This concept of husnul dhann versus su'al dhann, assuming good always about people or assuming bad about people and human nature. And so Jonathan Brown discusses this all in his book, Hadith there. So I highly recommend that you take a look at it. And here I have some books for further reading in case you want to get more involved in refuting Orientalism or looking at post-colonial thought as it's known, which was primarily started with anti-colonial writers like Frantz Fanon, and Edward Said really propelled the field forward as well. A lot of post-colonial writings came after Edward Said and discuss Orientalism quite heavily, or the ideas in it heavily. So I highly recommend these readings and books if you want to better understand Orientalism and how it's related to colonialism, how knowledge and political power go hand in hand. And with that, I will bid you adieu. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.